The whistle came first. Not a train whistle, a police whistle, sharp and sudden, cutting through the smog of the industrial quarter like a blade through silk. Ezra Cade froze mid-step, one hand still on the brass door handle of his warehouse, the other gripping a ledger full of numbers that could put half the city council behind bars. Then came the boots, dozens of them, pounding cobblestone. Raid! It's a raid! Ezra didn't wait to see who was shouting. He shoved the ledger inside his coat and ran. Behind him, his syndicate's headquarters, 3 floors of gearworks, smuggling routes and secrets, lit up with search lamps. Iron-shod officers spilled from steam wagons, badges flashing under the amber street lanterns. At the front of them, seated smugly in his personal carriage, was City Commissioner Alden Voss. The man never got his own hands dirty. He simply pointed, and other men bled for him. Ezra sprinted through the alley behind the building, boots slipping on wet stone, lungs burning from the sulfur-thick air. This wasn't supposed to happen tonight. His informants inside the department were supposed to warn him before anything like this, which meant one of 2 things. Either they'd been bought off, or they were already in chains. He rounded the corner where his getaway coupe waited, hidden beneath a canvas tarp. It wasn't much to look at, a squat, brass-plated vehicle with a hissing steam engine, bolted to the back, built for speed over style. He ripped the tarp away, threw himself into the driver's seat, and slammed his palm against the ignition valve. The engine screamed to life. That was when he heard it. A breath, not his own. Ezra's hand shot to the pistol tucked in his waistband before his brain even caught up with his instincts. He spun toward the footwell on the passenger side, and the barrel lowered an inch, because what he saw made no sense. A woman, curled into the cramped space beneath the dashboard, knees to her chest, dark hair falling loose from a hood that had slipped back in the scramble to hide. Her eyes lifted to his, and for one suspended second, neither of them breathed. Ezra hadn't seen those eyes in 8 years. Sora! Her name came out of him like something torn loose. He hadn't said it aloud in years. Not since the trial, not since the day she'd been marched out of the city in chains, while he stood in the crowd, forbidden by his own father from saying a word in her defense. Sora Vale, exiled, disgraced. The woman the whole city believed had stolen the greatest invention of the decade and sold it to a rival nation. The woman he had once loved enough to consider giving up everything for. "Drive," she said, voice hoarse, like she hadn't used it in hours. "Ezra, drive now, or we're both finished." He didn't move. Search lamps were sweeping the mouth of the alley, close enough that he could hear Voss barking orders through a megaphone. Every second they sat still was a second closer to capture, and yet his hands stayed frozen on the wheel, because nothing about this made sense. Sora Vale did not simply reappear in the footwell of his getaway car on the exact night his empire came crashing down. Coincidences like that didn't exist. Not in his world. "Why are you here?" he demanded, even as his foot found the pedal and the coupe lurched forward, wheels screeching as he tore out of the alley into a side street thick with steam and shadow. Behind them, shouts rose. A shot cracked against the cobblestone, wide. Sora scrambled up into the seat properly now, bracing herself against the door as the coupe fishtailed around a corner. Blood was crusted along her hairline. Her coat was torn at the shoulder. Wherever she'd come from, it hadn't been a gentle journey. "I need something from you," she said, "and I don't have time to explain it gently." "Try anyway." The watch. Her eyes locked onto the chain visible at his collar, where his father's antique brass pocket watch hung, tucked inside his shirt, the way it always had been since the day the old man was dragged off to prison. "Your father's watch. Give it to me." Ezra almost laughed, despite the drones now audible somewhere behind them. despite the commissioner's voice screaming his name into a megaphone that echoed off brick walls. "That's a family heirloom, Sora. It isn't for sale, and it certainly isn't for handing over to a woman I haven't seen since I was exiled for a crime I didn't commit." She said it flatly, without self-pity, the way someone states a fact they've repeated in their own head 1,000 times. "That watch isn't just a keepsake, Ezra. There's a mechanism inside it, a cipher, built into the gearing itself. It's the only proof left in this city that Alden Voss orchestrated the Ether Core heist 8 years ago. Not me, him." The coupe hit a straightaway, and for a moment the world narrowed to the hiss of the engine, the pounding of Ezra's heart, and the impossible weight of what she'd just said. "That's not possible," he said, though his hand had already drifted to his collar, fingers finding the familiar shape of the watch through his shirt. "My father would have told me." Sora turned to look at him, and in the search lamp light flooding briefly through the rear window, he saw something in her face he hadn't expected. Not triumph, not vindication, fear. "Your father did tell you," she said quietly. "He just never told you what it meant." Behind them, the sirens grew louder. Ahead, the city lights blurred into streaks of gold and gray. Neither of them said another word until the alley disappeared behind them completely. The gear workshop hadn't seen daylight in 8 years. Ezra led Sora down through a hidden hatch behind his warehouse, past 3 false walls and a rusted ladder, into a stone chamber, lit only by the blue-white glow of gas lamps. Tools hung from every surface: soldering irons, calipers, coils of copper wire, remnants of a life he'd abandoned the day his father was taken. He hadn't touched most of it in years. Somehow, walking back in with Sora beside him, it didn't feel abandoned anymore. It felt like a room that had been waiting. "Nobody knows this place exists," he said, bolting the hatch shut behind them. "Not Voss, not my own men. If you're planning to betray me again, you picked a poor place to do it." Sora didn't rise to the bait. She was already at the workbench, clearing a space among the scattered tools, with the brisk efficiency of someone who had once belonged in a room exactly like this. "I never betrayed you the first time," she said, not looking up. "Give me the watch. We don't have long before Voss puts every checkpoint in the city on alert." He hesitated only a moment before pulling the chain over his head and setting the watch in her open palm. It felt strange to let it go, heavier in her hand than it had ever felt in his own pocket. Sora turned it over, running her thumb along a hairline seam at the base that Ezra had never noticed in 20 years of carrying it. She pried a tiny latch loose with a jeweler's pick, and the back panel swung open, revealing not the plain clockwork he expected, but something far stranger: a nest of impossibly small gears, stacked in overlapping rings, engraved with symbols that weren't numbers at all. "A cipher wheel," she murmured, more to herself than to him. "Your father built this into the movement itself. Brilliant. Nobody would ever think to look." "Look for what?" "A confession." She glanced up at him. "Not mine. Voss's. Recorded the night before the heist. Encoded into this mechanism. Your father witnessed it. Voss bragging to his own men about how he was going to frame an apprentice for a crime he was about to commit himself. Your father recorded the whole exchange on a wax cylinder and built this cipher to encode the transcript into the watch's gearing. It's been sitting against your chest for 8 years, Ezra." Ezra sat down heavily on an old workbench stool, the weight of it pressing on his chest harder than any raid ever had. Then why didn't he just come forward? Why let you take the fall, let himself go to prison, and say nothing? "Because Voss threatened to end him the moment he opened his mouth," Sora said. "This was never just about clearing a name. It was about surviving long enough to use it." She reached for a delicate pick and tried to turn the smallest gear ring. It resisted, groaning under years of dust and rust, and she winced, pulling her hand back sharply. "It's seized," she said. "The whole cipher mechanism. If I force it, I could snap the teeth clean off and lose the confession forever. Then what do we do? There's a tool that can do this properly. A harmonic tuning fork, calibrated to the exact resonance of this alloy. It vibrates the gears loose without touching them. No force needed." She turned the watch over again, studying it like an old friend she hadn't seen in years. "There's a second failsafe built in too. If anyone tries to force the mechanism with the wrong tool, there's a spring-loaded striker inside that shatters the entire cipher wheel. Self-destruct, built right into your father's watch." Ezra let out a breath that was half disbelief, half exhausted laugh. "Of course there is." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The gas lamps hissed overhead, and Sora bent low over the workbench, close enough that Ezra could smell rain and copper on her coat, close enough that the 8 years between them collapsed into nothing at all. He remembered afternoons just like this one. The two of them hunched over some half-finished invention, arguing over gear ratios, laughing about nothing, before the world had decided to tear them apart. "You could have told me," he said quietly. "Back then, before the trial, you could have told me what you knew." Sora's hands stilled on the watch. Would it have mattered? Everyone had already decided I was guilty before I said a word. I wouldn't have. She looked up at him then, and something old and unspoken passed between them. Not quite forgiveness, not quite blame, something more complicated than either. "I know," she said softly. "That's exactly why I couldn't tell you." Before Ezra could ask what that meant, a new thought settled over him, cold and sudden. Wait, if my father built this cipher, knowing exactly what it contained, knowing it would eventually need someone with the skill to extract it, why leave it with me? "I don't have your training. I never finished my apprenticeship at the guild." Sora was quiet for a long moment, turning the watch over once more in her hands. "Because he knew I'd come back for it," she finally said. "He didn't leave this with you by accident, Ezra. He left it with you because he knew that someday I would need a reason to find my way back to you. And this was the only reason strong enough to bring me through that door." The gas lamps flickered. Somewhere above them, faint through the stone, the wail of a search siren rose and faded into the night. "We need that tuning fork," Sora said, closing the watch's back panel with careful hands. "And I know exactly where to find one, if we're willing to walk into the most dangerous market in the city to get it." The Undercity brass market never slept. Ezra and Sora descended into it through a service tunnel beneath a defunct textile mill, emerging into a cavern of stacked stalls, hanging lanterns, and the ceaseless clatter of illegal trade. Smugglers hawked contraband steam parts. Fortune tellers read gear oil stains like tea leaves. Somewhere, a brass band played something too cheerful for a place this lawless. The air smelled of oil, roasted chestnuts, and danger. "Stay close," Ezra said, pulling his collar higher and his hat lower. He'd traded his usual coat for something plainer, and Sora had wrapped a scarf around the lower half of her face. But disguises only bought so much time in a place like this. Every second stall owner in the bazaar had, at some point, done business with his syndicate. Recognition was a currency here too. "There," Sora murmured, nodding toward a cramped stall wedged between a locksmith and a taxidermist, its shelves crowded with delicate instruments that had no business existing outside a laboratory. A hunched old tinkerer sat behind the counter, one mechanical eye whirring as it adjusted focus on their approach. "Sora Vale," the tinkerer rasped, before either of them had said a word. "Didn't expect to see that face again. Thought you were exiled clear past the mountains." "I was," Sora said. "I need a harmonic tuning fork, calibrated for Ethereum bronze alloy. The old resonance standard, not the new commercial ones. The tinkerer's human eye narrowed. That's a specific request. Nobody's asked me for one of those in 8 years. His gaze slid to Ezra, then to the faint outline of the watch chain visible beneath his coat, and something like understanding flickered across his weathered face. Ah, I see. You found the little bird's cage, didn't you? We don't have time for riddles, Ezra said. Name your price. The tinkerer studied them both a moment longer, then reached beneath his counter and produced a slim leather case. Inside, nestled in velvet, sat a tuning fork forged from a metal that seemed to shimmer faintly even in the low lantern light. 300 marks, and a warning, free of charge. Voss has had men combing this market since sundown. Word is, he's offering a bounty for anyone caught helping either of you. Ezra was already counting bills into the man's palm when the market lanterns above them flickered and dimmed in unison. Not a natural flicker, but a deliberate, mechanical one. A klaxon wail rose from the tunnel entrance, and the easy chatter of the bazaar dissolved into panicked shouting. "Drones!" the tinkerer hissed, already sweeping his instruments off the counter and into a hidden compartment beneath it. "Go now! Through the back!" It was too late. 4 clockwork enforcers marched into the cavern from the main tunnel, brass-plated and eyeless, their apprehension nets whirring to life on mechanical arms. They weren't built to finish. Voss preferred his captures alive, paraded through the streets as trophies. But the crushing grip of their capture claws could break bones just the same. And there were 4 of them closing fast, scanning the crowd with pulsing red lenses. "This way," Ezra said, grabbing Sora's wrist and hauling her between 2 stalls as the crowd scattered around them in a chaos of overturned crates and shattered glass. One drone's lens locked onto them, and it surged forward with alarming speed, its net arm swinging wide. Sora didn't run. She turned, calm as still water, and pulled a small brass device from her coat. A coil of wire wrapped tight around a magnetized core. "Electromagnetic disruptor," she said, more to herself than him, thumbing a switch on its side. "Should still work, if I built it right." She hurled it at the approaching drone's chest plate. It clamped on with a magnetic snap and released a violent pulse of current. The drone seized mid-stride, its red lens flickering erratically before the whole machine collapsed in a heap of twitching brass limbs. "You built that," Ezra said, incredulous, even as he grabbed a fallen stall pole and swung it hard into the joint of a second approaching drone, buckling its leg with brute force. "I've had 8 years with nothing to do but build things," Sora said, already pulling another disruptor from an inner pocket. Turns out exile is excellent for invention. Together they moved through the chaos like they'd rehearsed it 100 times. Ezra clearing a path with raw strength and syndicate instinct. Sora disabling machines with quiet precision, each of them somehow anticipating the other's next move, without a word exchanged. A third drone lunged for Sora from behind. Ezra hauled a stall table over and slammed it into the machine's legs, sending it crashing into a display of scrap metal. The fourth, faster than the others, cornered them near the tunnel exit, net arm already extending. Sora's last disruptor was gone. She looked at Ezra, and for one heartbeat, he saw real fear in her eyes. Not for herself, he realized, but for him. Ezra didn't think. He grabbed a lantern hook from the nearest stall, swung it hard into the drone's optical lens, and as it staggered, blinded, he shoved Sora bodily through the narrow tunnel exit behind them, following a half-second later as the machine's net snapped closed on empty air. They ran until the shouting behind them faded into distant echoes, until the tunnel opened into a rain-slicked alley far from the bazaar's chaos. And only then did they stop, breathing hard, backs against a damp brick wall. "You still have it?" Ezra asked between breaths. Sora patted her coat pocket, where the leather case sat safe against her ribs. Never let go of it. Not once. Ezra allowed himself a moment, just a moment, to look at her properly. Rain matting her dark hair to her face, eyes bright with adrenaline, and felt something shift in his chest that he hadn't let himself feel in 8 long years. "We can't go back to the workshop," he said finally, forcing his mind back to the danger still hunting them. "Voss will have it surrounded by morning. We need to get out of the city." Sora nodded toward the rail yards glowing faintly in the distance, steam rising from idle freight engines. "Then we don't walk out," she said. "We ride." The freight train groaned to life, just as Ezra and Sora slipped between 2 idle cargo cars and hauled themselves up into an empty one stacked with crates of machine parts. The heavy door rattled shut behind them, sealing out the rain and the last flickering lights of the city as the train lurched forward, gathering speed toward the mountain line. For a long while, neither of them spoke. Sora sat against a crate, catching her breath, the tuning fork case still clutched against her chest, like something sacred. Ezra watched the city lights shrink through a gap in the door, waiting for the adrenaline to drain out of his limbs, and finding that it didn't. Not really. Not with her sitting 3 feet away. "You should sleep," he said finally. "We've got hours before the mountain crossing." "I won't sleep," Sora said. "I haven't slept properly in 8 years, Ezra." Not really. Something in the way she said it made him look at her directly for the first time since the bazaar. "What was it like?" he asked. "Out there. Exile." She was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark shapes of warehouses blur past through the gap in the door. "Cold," she said eventually. "Lonely. In a way I don't think you can understand unless you've lived it. I spent the first 2 years in a border town, working as a clockmaker's assistant under a false name, terrified every single day that someone would recognize me and drag me back to finish the sentence Voss never actually let them impose." She let out a short, humorless laugh. "Exile was supposed to be mercy, you know. That's what everyone said at the trial. Lucky she wasn't hanged. Nobody thought to ask what it costs a person, being erased from their own life." Ezra felt something twist painfully in his chest. He'd spent 8 years telling himself a simplified version of the story. Sora had been caught, Sora had been punished, life had moved on. He'd never let himself sit with what those years had actually looked like for her, because looking too closely meant admitting how much he'd failed her by staying silent. "I should have fought harder for you," he said. "At the trial, I stood in that crowd and said nothing, because my father told me to protect the family name, and I listened to him instead of—" "Stop." Sora's voice cut through the rattle of the train, sharper than he expected. "You don't understand what actually happened that night, Ezra. Nobody does, not even your father, not fully." He straightened. "Then tell me." Sora was quiet for so long he thought she might refuse. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped low, stripped of its usual composure. "I didn't take the fall because I was cornered, or because the evidence against me was too strong to fight. I took the fall because Voss came to me 3 days before the trial and told me exactly what would happen if I didn't." "What do you mean?" "He told me he had 2 paths laid out. In one, I confessed to the heist, took the exile sentence, and disappeared quietly. In the other, he'd make sure the evidence pointed at you instead, the syndicate boss's son, conveniently already suspicious in the eyes of half the city. And once you were convicted, he'd see to it that you were sent somewhere far worse than exile. The labor camps in the Eastern Territories. People don't come back from those, Ezra. Not whole, if they come back at all." Ezra felt the floor of the cargo car tilt beneath him, though the train hadn't changed speed at all. "He threatened to destroy me. And you. I fabricated the evidence against myself, Sora said, meeting his eyes now, steady, despite the tremor in her voice. I planted the forged documents Voss needed. I rehearsed a false confession until it sounded true enough to convince a courtroom. I did it because your father was already in prison, and I knew if you went down too, there would be no one left to survive this family. No one left to eventually make things right. Her jaw tightened. So I let the entire city believe I was a thief. I let you believe it, for 8 years, because the alternative was watching you disappear into a labor camp while I stood by and did nothing to stop it. The train rattled on through the dark, mountain air growing colder with every mile, and Ezra sat frozen, staring at the woman across from him as 8 years of assumptions collapsed all at once. You sacrificed everything, he said quietly, and let me hate the wrong version of the story for 8 years. I didn't let you hate anything, Sora said. You never hated me, Ezra. You mourned me. There's a difference, and I knew it, even from exile. I told myself that was enough, that you were safe and free, and that was worth more than my name. Ezra crossed the small space between them and knelt in front of her, close enough now that he could see the exhaustion etched into every line of her face. 8 years of carrying a secret alone, finally cracking open in the dim light of a freight car. It wasn't enough, he said, voice rough. It was never going to be enough, Sora. Not for me. For the first time since she'd climbed into his getaway car, Sora let her guard fall completely, and something raw and unguarded passed across her face. Grief, relief, and something that looked almost like hope, all tangled together. We're not just chasing a confession anymore, she said quietly. We're trying to undo 8 years of a lie I built with my own hands, and I don't know if the truth will be enough to fix what it cost us. Outside, the train began to climb into the mountains, the city disappearing behind a wall of pine and fog, carrying them both toward the one place that might finally hold the proof they needed. The Grand Clockmakers Guild rose out of the mountain fog like something carved from memory itself, a cathedral of brass domes and glass towers, its spires ticking in perfect synchronized rhythm, audible even from the train platform below. Ezra hadn't set foot near the place in over a decade. Sora hadn't been allowed to at all. Guild neutrality still holds, she said, adjusting her scarf as they climbed the long stone steps toward the entrance. Whatever happens inside these walls, the Guild doesn't answer to city law, or to Voss. It's the one place in this territory he can't simply march in and arrest us. That's assuming they still recognize you as a Guild member, Ezra said carefully. They don't. My credentials were stripped the day of the trial. Sora's mouth tightened. But the archive itself is open to any petitioner who can prove Guild-adjacent lineage, and my father trained half the senior archivists, still working here. That should be enough to get us through the door. It was. The receiving hall was vast and hushed, lined floor to ceiling, with ticking clocks of every conceivable design, and the elderly archivist at the front desk barely glanced up before waving them toward the western wing at the mention of Sora's father's name. Ezra found himself relieved and unsettled in equal measure, relieved that the plan was working, unsettled by how easily this place still recognized her, as if 8 years of exile had never happened at all. They made their way through the towering stacks in search of the architectural archives, and it was there, threading between shelves of blueprints older than the city itself, that the weight of the building began to press on both of them differently than the danger had. We studied here together, Sora said quietly, running her fingers along a shelf edge without quite touching it. 3rd floor, East Reading Room. You used to fall asleep over the gear ratio texts and swear you'd only closed your eyes to think. Ezra huffed something close to a laugh. You used to wake me up by dropping a spanner directly onto the desk. It worked, didn't it? Every time. He paused at the base of a spiral staircase, looking up toward the domed ceiling far above, gears turning in slow, hypnotic rhythm against painted constellations. I used to think I'd spend my whole life in a building like this. Before everything happened, before I had to leave and take up my father's business instead. Sora turned to look at him properly, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "The syndicate, the life you built instead of the one you trained for." "I used to tell myself I didn't have a choice," Ezra admitted. "My father was in prison, the business needed someone at the helm, and I was the only Cade left standing. But some nights, I'd catch myself sketching gear assemblies on the back of ledger pages instead of doing actual syndicate work, and I'd wonder what might have happened if things had gone differently. If you'd still been here, if we'd both finished our apprenticeships the way we planned." "We were 20, Sora said softly. "We thought we had all the time in the world to figure it out." "We did have time," Ezra said. "Voss just decided to take it from both of us." They found the architectural archive room at the end of the western wing, a narrow chamber lined with drawers of blueprints catalogued by district and decade, dust thick enough to taste in the air. Sora moved through it with practiced efficiency, pulling drawer after drawer, searching for anything cross-referenced with the old Ether Core facility. It was while she was crouched over a low drawer, sorting through decades-old survey maps, that Ezra found himself simply watching her. The careful, precise way her hands moved, the small furrow of concentration between her brows, that he remembered from 100 afternoons, just like this one, years ago, before either of their lives had been upended. "You're staring," Sora said, without looking up. "I'm remembering," Ezra corrected. She glanced up then, something soft and unguarded crossing her face. "I used to think about this place, you know, during exile. Not the trial, not the sentencing, this room, specifically. Late nights working beside you, arguing about tolerances on a prototype nobody but us would ever care about. It was the last time I remember feeling like my life was entirely my own." "It could be again," Ezra said, before he'd fully decided to say it. "Once this is over, once Voss is exposed and you're cleared, there's no reason you couldn't come back here, reclaim your credentials, build the life that got taken from you." Sora's expression flickered. Hope, quickly guarded again, the way a person protects something too fragile to risk losing twice. "One thing at a time," she said, but her voice had lost its edge, softened into something closer to the woman he remembered from before everything broke. "We find the vault location first. Everything else comes after." She turned back to the drawer, and after a moment, pulled free a survey map yellowed with age, marked with a district long since abandoned by the city's expansion. "Here," she said, spreading it across the reading table between them, tracing a finger along an unmarked structure at the map's edge. "Subterranean storage, built beneath what used to be our apprentice workshop, before it was condemned. It matches the layout your father's notes described." She looked up at him, something fierce and hopeful lighting her face for the first time since the raid. "This is it, Ezra. This is where the truth has been buried for 8 years. Ezra reached out and covered her hand with his own, steadying it against the table, and for a moment the distance and grief of 8 years seemed to collapse entirely, leaving only the two of them, exactly as they'd been before the world decided to tear them apart. Neither of them noticed the door to the archive room easing shut behind them, nor the soft click of a lock turning from the outside. The click of the lock was so soft that Ezra almost mistook it for the settling of old wood. It was Sora who reacted first, spinning toward the door with the map still clutched in her hand, her instincts sharpened by 8 years of learning to trust nothing. "Ezra," he was already moving, crossing the archive room in 3 strides and throwing his weight against the door. It didn't budge. Solid oak, reinforced with iron banding, built to protect priceless blueprints from fire and theft alike, and now, apparently, built to hold 2 people exactly where someone wanted them. "Guildmaster Renfield," Ezra shouted through the wood. "Open this door. Guild neutrality protects any petitioner within these walls. You know the law as well as I do." A long silence answered him. Then, footsteps, slow, deliberate, accompanied by a second set, heavier, marching in the rigid cadence of trained officers. Ezra's stomach dropped, even before the voice came through the door, smug and familiar in the worst possible way. "Guild neutrality," Commissioner Alden Voss said, his voice carrying easily through the old wood, "protects petitioners from city law, Mr. Cade. It says nothing about a guildmaster's right to detain trespassers within his own archive, on his own authority, until the proper authorities arrive to collect them." A soft, satisfied chuckle. "Funny thing about neutrality, it only holds as long as nobody in the building has already been paid to look the other way." Sora's face had gone pale. "Renfield," she said, disbelief coloring her voice. "He trained under my father. He wouldn't." "Everyone has a price, Miss Vale," Voss called back, his footsteps drawing closer to the door. "Even old men who claim to value tradition above all else." Renfield's price, it turns out, was rather modest. A donation to the Guild's failing archive fund, and the promise that his name would never be associated with harboring 2 fugitives. A pause, deliberate and cruel. "You should have chosen your sanctuary more carefully." Ezra looked around the archive room with the fast, assessing eyes of a man who had spent his life finding exits in impossible situations. High windows, too narrow and too far up to reach without something to stand on. A single door, now sealed and guarded, and along the far wall an old iron ventilation grate, rusted but intact, feeding into a shaft that ran up through the building's stone foundation. "The ventilation system," he said quietly. "It has to connect somewhere outside." "It vents into the old boiler room," Sora said, already moving toward it, memory of her apprentice years serving her better than any map. "But the shaft's too narrow to climb through, and even if we could fit, it would take too long. Voss will have that door forced open before we're halfway there." "Then we don't climb through it," Ezra said, an idea sharpening fast in his mind. "We use it." He crossed to a rack of decommissioned steam tools kept for archive restoration work. Old pipe sections, a spare pressure valve, a canister of compressed gas used for cleaning delicate machinery. Sora understood before he'd even finished explaining, her engineer's mind already 3 steps ahead. "A pressure charge," she said. "Contained, directional, enough force to blow the door off its hinges without bringing down the whole wing." She was already pulling pipe fittings free, hands moving with the same steady precision he remembered from years ago. "It's dangerous, Ezra. Too much pressure, and we bring the ceiling down on our own heads. Then we build it carefully," he said. "We've done harder things together in less time." Outside, they could hear Voss's officers working at the door's hinges with iron pry bars, testing the old wood's resistance. They had minutes, not hours. Working in perfect, wordless tandem, Ezra and Sora assembled the makeshift device against the base of the door. Pipe sections packed tight, the pressure valve rigged to release all at once, the compressed gas canister feeding the chamber with a low, building hiss. It was reckless, improvised, built from scraps and desperation, and it was exactly the kind of thing the 2 of them had once built together as reckless 20-year-olds who thought nothing was impossible. "On my mark," Sora said, one hand on the valve. "We need everyone clear of the door." If Voss's men are standing where I think they are, they'll be knocked flat, not finished, Ezra finished. That's the idea. The hinges groaned outside. Wood splintered. A voice, one of the officers, shouted a warning about forcing entry. Now, Sora said, and twisted the valve. The pressure released in a single violent burst, and the old oak door didn't just open. It exploded outward, off its hinges entirely, slamming into the corridor beyond with a force that sent Voss's officers scattering, several of them thrown clean off their feet by the shockwave and the choking cloud of steam that billowed out after it. "Go!" Ezra shouted, grabbing Sora's hand and pulling her through the wreckage before the steam had even cleared. Past stunned officers still scrambling to their feet, past Guildmaster Renfield frozen in the corridor with an expression of pale, guilty shock. Voss's furious shout chased them down the hall, but by the time his men had regrouped, Ezra and Sora were already through a side exit, out into the mountain air. Snow had begun to fall, thick and silent, blanketing the guild's stone courtyard in white. They ran without looking back, boots sinking into fresh drifts, the warm glow of the guild's windows shrinking behind them until only the dark shapes of pine forest remained ahead. "He's not going to stop," Sora said between breaths, snow catching in her dark hair. "Not now. Not after we've made him look like a fool in front of half the guild." "He was never going to stop," Ezra said grimly, pulling her forward into the tree line as distant shouts echoed behind them. "But now we know exactly where the vault is. And there's only one place left he'd never think to look for us first." Ahead, through the snow and the dark, the outline of a long-abandoned workshop waited at the edge of the mountain slope, the place where both their stories had truly begun. By the time they reached it, the snow had softened into a fine, drifting hush, settling over the collapsed roof and broken windows of the old apprentice workshop like something trying gently to bury the past. Ezra hadn't seen the building in 10 years. It looked smaller than he remembered, and somehow more fragile. Vines choking the stone walls, the once proud sign above the door reduced to a single hanging letter, swinging faintly in the wind. "It's still standing," Sora said quietly, almost disbelieving, as they approached through the trees. "I thought the city would have torn it down years ago. Nobody wanted the land," Ezra said. "Cursed, some of the older workers used to call it. Bad luck, after everything that happened here." He glanced sideways at her. "I suppose they weren't entirely wrong." They slipped through a gap where a side door had long since rotted off its frame, into a main hall thick with dust and the smell of old rain-soaked wood. Moonlight fell through a broken section of roof, illuminating rows of collapsed workbenches and rusted equipment nobody had bothered to salvage. It felt less like a building and more like a memory they were walking through together. "The vault should be beneath the central floor," Sora said, moving carefully into the room, eyes scanning the warped floorboards. "Your father's notes mentioned a storage chamber, accessible from the old testing bay. That would put it—" She paused, orienting herself against a memory 10 years old. "There, beneath where the main workbench used to stand." Ezra followed her gaze to a section of floor near the center of the room, and something cold settled in his stomach. "That's not just old flooring, is it?" "No," Sora said grimly. "It's a pressure plate lock system. Your father was thorough, even back then. I remember watching him install something like this once, years before either of us really understood what he was protecting." She crouched at the floor's edge, brushing away a layer of dust to reveal faint seams in the wood, arranged in an irregular grid. Each plate triggers a different response if weighted wrong. Some are harmless, others release lockdown cages from the ceiling, strong enough to trap a person until guild security arrives. Except there's no guild security coming for us tonight. If we trigger the wrong sequence out here, we're trapped with no one left to save us. You know the layout? I used to. It's been 10 years, Ezra. I can't guarantee my memory is perfect. It's the only guarantee we've got, he said. I trust it. Sora looked up at him, something vulnerable flickering across her face at the weight of that trust, before she nodded and rose to her feet. Stay exactly where I step, not an inch to either side. If I miscount, I need you far enough behind me that only one of us gets caught. That's not how this works, Ezra said flatly. We go together, or not at all. Ezra, I've trusted your instincts with worse than a floor puzzle tonight, he said. Lead, I'll follow exactly. Sora exhaled slowly, and something in her posture settled, as though his refusal to leave distance between them had answered a question she'd been afraid to ask. She stepped onto the first plate, a worn section near the doorway, and nothing happened. A slow breath escaped her. Second plate, she murmured, half to herself, half to him. 3 steps left. Avoid the center seam entirely. That one drops the whole section, if the underlying gears rusted through. Ezra matched her steps precisely, watching the floor for the faintest change in the dust pattern that might betray a memory gone wrong. They moved like that across the room, plate by plate, Sora murmuring half-remembered fragments of a decade-old lesson, Ezra trusting her completely with every step, until they stood at the center of the room, directly above where the vault waited below. This is it, Sora said, crouching to find the release mechanism hidden along the floor's edge. A small brass lever, disguised as part of the room's original molding. One more step. If I've remembered correctly, this opens the stairwell down without triggering anything else. Her hand hovered over the lever, hesitating for the first time since they'd entered the room. What if I'm wrong? She asked quietly. What if 10 years has cost me the one thing that mattered, the thing that could actually clear both our names? Ezra crouched beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched, and covered her hand with his own on the lever. Then we've still made it further tonight than either of us thought possible 8 years ago, he said. Together. That's not nothing, Sora. Whatever happens next. Something in her expression softened completely. 8 years of guarded distance, finally dissolving into something raw and unguarded. For a moment, neither of them moved, the ruined workshop around them holding its breath along with them. Together, she echoed softly, and pulled the lever. The floor groaned, ancient gears grinding to life somewhere below, and a section of the board split apart with a low mechanical hiss, revealing a narrow stone stairwell descending into darkness. No cages fell, no alarms sounded, only silence, and the faint, cold draft of air that had been sealed away for a decade, rising up to meet them. Sora let out a breath that was half laugh, half disbelief, relief flooding through her voice. I remembered correctly. You always did have the better memory, Ezra said, managing a small, tired smile despite everything. He reached for an old lantern hanging abandoned on a nearby hook, struck a match with hands that weren't quite steady, and held the flickering light out over the stairwell's mouth. Below them, stone steps disappeared into shadow, leading toward whatever truth had been waiting, buried, for 8 long years. Ready? He asked. Sora took his offered hand instead of answering, and together they stepped down into the dark. The stairwell opened into a chamber that time seemed to have forgotten entirely. Stone walls, untouched by the decay above, stretched around a room dominated by a single structure at its center. A vault door unlike anything Ezra had ever seen. Its surface, a mosaic of interlocking brass gears, each one etched with symbols that mirrored the cipher wheel hidden inside his father's watch. He built this too, Ezra said quietly, lantern light flickering across the vault's intricate face. How long was my father planning this? Longer than either of us knew, I think. Sora moved closer, running her fingers along the vault's cold surface with something close to reverence. This isn't just a lock, Ezra. It's a testament. Your father didn't just want to hide the truth. He wanted to build something that only the two of us, together, could ever open. She was right. At the vault's center sat two matching gear assemblies, positioned side by side, each requiring a hand to operate. Ezra had seen mechanisms like it before in guild texts, dual operator locks, designed so that no single person, however skilled, could open them alone. But this one was different. The gear patterns weren't standard guild sequences. They were unique, unfamiliar, and yet something about their rhythm tugged at a memory buried deep in Ezra's hands. "Wait," he said slowly, stepping closer. "I know this sequence." Sora's breath caught. "You couldn't. Unless—" "The prototype," Ezra said, understanding dawning across his face. "Our final apprentice project. The synchronized gear assembly we built together. The one we invented because neither of us could get the timing right alone. We spent a month perfecting that exact turning sequence." He looked at her, disbelief and wonder tangled together. "My father must have watched us build it. He copied our sequence into this lock. The dual signature." Sora breathed, the old name for their invention rising unbidden to her lips, unused in 8 years. He knew. Even then, he knew this day would come. They stepped up to the twin gear assemblies, one on each side, and for a moment Ezra felt the years collapse entirely. 20 years old again, hunched over a workbench with Sora across from him, arguing about tolerances, laughing about nothing, building something neither of them fully understood the importance of yet. "Do you remember the sequence?" he asked. "Every turn of it," Sora said, and something fierce and certain settled over her face. "Left hand first, 3/4 turn, then wait for my signal." Their hands found the gears at the same moment, and the years fell away completely. Ezra turned his assembly a precise 3/4, feeling the old rhythm return to his fingers like something that had never truly left them. Sora matched him a half-second later, her turn perfectly timed to his, and the gears began to sing, a low, resonant hum building between the two mechanisms as they moved in practiced harmony, exactly as they had a decade ago, back when the hardest thing in either of their lives had been getting a gear ratio exactly right. "Now the reverse," Sora said, voice tight with concentration. "Together, on 3. 1, Ezra counted, eyes locked on hers across the vault door. 2. Their hands moved as one on the final beat, gears reversing in perfect synchronized motion, and the vault door shuddered, deep mechanisms releasing somewhere within the stone walls around them. Slowly, impossibly, the heavy brass door swung inward, revealing a chamber beyond that neither of them had seen in 8 years. Inside, illuminated by their lantern light, sat rows of carefully preserved blueprints, sealed behind glass casings, to protect them from decay. At the center of the collection, framed and displayed as though someone had wanted it protected above all else, hung the original schematics for the Ether Core, the invention whose theft had destroyed both their lives 8 years ago. And at the bottom corner of every page, unmistakable even after all this time, was Sora's signature. "Oh," Sora breathed, stepping forward with trembling hands, tracing the edge of the glass without quite touching it. "These are mine, the original designs, not stolen copies, the actual originals, dated and signed, months before the Aether Core was ever unveiled to the public." "This proves it," Ezra said, moving beside her, studying the blueprints with growing understanding. "Voss didn't just frame you for theft. He stole your invention entirely and presented it as his own creation. Everything he's built since, his entire technological empire, it's founded on your work." 8 years, Sora said quietly, voice breaking for the first time since Ezra had found her hiding in his car. 8 years of exile, disgrace, hiding under false names. And it wasn't even a heist I was falsely accused of covering up for someone else. It was theft of my own invention, dressed up as a crime I supposedly committed against him. Ezra reached out and gently turned her toward him, away from the blueprints, meeting her eyes directly. "It's over now," he said. "Whatever else happens tonight, this proves everything. Your name, your work, your innocence, it's all right here, protected exactly as my father intended." Sora's composure finally broke completely. Tears she'd clearly been holding back for 8 years, finally spilling free, and Ezra pulled her into his arms, without hesitation, holding her the way he'd wanted to for a decade, in the one place that had witnessed both the beginning of everything they'd once shared, and now, finally, the proof that could restore it. "Thank you," Sora whispered against his shoulder, "for trusting me, for following me down here without ever once asking if I was certain." "I've always trusted you," Ezra said quietly, "even when I didn't understand why the world seemed determined to prove me wrong for it." Outside, faint and distant through the stone walls above them, came a sound that shattered the moment entirely. The low, mechanical growl of approaching steam vehicles, dozens of them, converging on the ruined workshop from every direction. Sora pulled back sharply, eyes wide with sudden alarm. "Voss found us." By the time they climbed back up through the broken floorboards, the workshop's shattered windows were already glowing with the harsh white light of search lamps. Ezra reached the doorway first, blueprints wrapped carefully in oilcloth and pressed against his chest, and what he saw through the gap in the rotted wood made his blood run cold. Steam wagons, dozens of them, ringed around the entire perimeter of the workshop, engines idling in the snow. Between them stood rows of Voss's personal police force, not the clockwork enforcers from the bazaar, but real men, armed and waiting, their breath fogging in the freezing air. And at the center of it all, standing beside his carriage with the calm, satisfied posture of a man who believed he had already won, was Commissioner Alden Voss. "There's no back exit," Sora said quietly, coming up beside him and taking in the scene with the same grim clarity. "He's had this whole slope covered since before we even entered the workshop. We were never going to walk out of here unnoticed." "Then we don't walk out quietly," Ezra said, already scanning the tree line for any gap in the ring of wagons. "We fight through." "With what?" Sora asked, gently but firmly. "2 of us against 30 armed men, Ezra. That isn't a fight. That's a massacre, and I won't watch it happen to you." Voss's voice carried up to them through a megaphone, echoing off the snow-heavy pines. "I know you're in there, Mr. Cade. Miss Vale, there's no version of tonight where you walk away from this hill with those blueprints. The only question left is how many of my men get hurt before you accept that." Ezra's grip tightened on the oilcloth bundle in his arms. "We hand over the evidence. Voss buries it, and he wins. We fight, and we both likely die out here in the snow, with the truth still hidden. There has to be another option." Sora was quiet for a long moment, watching the ring of steam wagons through the broken window, something resolving behind her eyes that Ezra didn't fully understand until she spoke again, voice steady and terribly calm. "There is another option," she said, "just not one you're going to like." "Sora, I surrender," she said simply. "Myself and the blueprints. I walk out there, I hand it all over, and Voss gets exactly what he wants. The last living witness to his crime. Back in chains. Story over. And you walk away clean. Ezra, no trial, no camps, no syndicate collapse. You get to live." "Absolutely not." Ezra grabbed her arm, something desperate rising in his chest. I didn't spend 8 years mourning you just to hand you back to him voluntarily. We find another way." "There isn't time for another way," Sora said, gently pulling free of his grip, her eyes glassy but resolved. "Listen to me. I've already lost 8 years to protect you from exactly this kind of danger. I'm not going to let tonight be the reason you lose everything, when I still have a way to prevent it. And what happens to you?" Ezra's voice cracked, all his careful composure finally breaking under the weight of what she was suggesting. "I just let Voss take you again, knowing what it cost you the first time?" Sora reached up and pressed her palm gently against his chest, over the place where his father's watch used to hang, now nestled deep in his coat pocket, alongside the blueprints. "You don't let anything happen," she said softly. "You survive tonight. You take what's left, and you find a way to finish what we started down there. That's the only ending that makes any of this worth it." Before Ezra could argue further, she'd already turned toward the door, straightening her shoulders, gathering the composure of the engineer who had once faced down a courtroom alone, rather than let harm come to him. She stepped out into the snow with her hands raised, the blueprints held carefully in one arm, walking steadily toward the ring of search lamps and waiting men. "Sora Vale," Voss's voice rang out, thick with satisfaction. "Surrendering. How wonderfully predictable." Ezra followed a few steps behind, close enough to stay near her, too far to stop what was already set in motion. Voss's men closed in immediately, forming a tight perimeter around Sora as she handed the blueprint case to a waiting officer, her chin lifted despite everything, refusing to let Voss see her break. It was in the final moment before the officers pulled her toward the waiting transport wagon. During one brief, permitted embrace that Voss allowed with the casual cruelty of a man enjoying his own victory, that Sora pulled Ezra close and pressed something small and cold into his coat pocket, her lips brushing his ear as she whispered so quietly only he could hear. "The cipher," she breathed. "The true one, not the copy Voss thinks he just took. Your father's confession is still in your pocket, Ezra. Exactly where it's always been. Finish what we started. Promise me." Before he could answer, before he could even fully process what she'd just done, the officers pulled her away, guiding her firmly toward the transport wagon. She didn't look back, Ezra understood, watching her walk with her spine straight and her head high, that looking back would have broken whatever resolve was keeping her upright. "A wise decision, Miss Vale," Voss called after her, climbing into his own carriage with an air of casual triumph. "As for you, Mr. Cade, go home. Rebuild whatever's left of your little syndicate, if you can. You're not worth my time tonight, not without her." The convoy of steam wagons rumbled to life, pulling away down the mountain road with Sora inside one of them, disappearing into the snow and darkness, exactly as she had 8 years before. Ezra stood alone in the ruined courtyard, snow settling on his shoulders, his hand closing tight around the small mechanical shape hidden in his coat pocket. The true cipher, the one thing Voss didn't know he still carried. He wasn't going to let this be the ending. Ezra didn't return to the workshop's ruins for long. By the time the last steam wagon's lights had vanished down the mountain road, he was already moving, cutting through the tree line toward the rail yard, the true cipher burning like a coal against his chest with every step. He caught the next freight train back toward the city before dawn, and somewhere in that long, cold ride, grief curdled into something harder and more useful. He wasn't going to walk into the commissioner's stronghold with fists and desperation. He was going to do what his father had built him to do, whether he'd ever wanted the inheritance or not. He was going to use the one weapon Voss had never accounted for, the syndicate itself. By the time he reached the city, the sun was rising pale and gray over the industrial quarter, and Ezra went straight to the one place he knew his men would still be loyal enough to listen, Boss, his second in command, a broad-shouldered woman named Marta, who'd run the transport lines for a decade, met him at the warehouse door with obvious relief. "We thought Voss had taken you too. Half the crew scattered after the raid, but the Union captains are still holding, waiting on your word." "Good," Ezra said, stepping past her into the warehouse, where a dozen anxious faces turned toward him. "Because I need every one of them tonight. Not for a war, for a blockade." He laid it out fast, pacing the length of the warehouse floor as he spoke, the exhaustion of the last 2 days burning away under the clarity of a plan finally taking shape. The syndicate controlled more than smuggling routes. It controlled half the transport unions, the factory floor workers, the men who kept the coal moving and the steam flowing through the arteries of the entire industrial grid. Voss's power depended on the appearance of control. Take that away, publicly and completely, and he'd have no choice but to answer for what he'd done. "We're not fighting his police force," Ezra said. "We're shutting down his city. Every factory, every rail line, every power conduit the syndicate touches, dead silent by nightfall, until Voss agrees to a public hearing. No violence. No bloodshed, just 8 years of debt, finally called in." Marta studied him for a long moment. "You know what this costs us, don't you? Every contract, every deal we've built with the council. It burns the moment we do this." "I know," Ezra said. "Do it anyway." By midday, word had spread through the union halls like wildfire. Ezra moved from district to district, meeting with factory foremen and rail captains who remembered his father's fair dealings, who'd watched Voss's corruption tighten its grip on the city for a decade without anyone powerful enough to challenge it openly. Some needed convincing. Most simply needed permission, a reason to finally stop looking away. By late afternoon, the first factory whistles fell silent. By evening, the transport lines had ground to a halt entirely, steam engines sitting cold and dark in the rail yards, while their operators walked out in coordinated, silent protest. The city's power grid, dependent on syndicate-controlled coal shipments, flickered and dimmed street by street until entire districts sat in unfamiliar darkness. Ezra stood atop a warehouse rooftop overlooking the industrial quarter as the blackout spread across the skyline, watching decades of his father's careful, quiet influence finally used for something other than profit. It felt less like victory and more like the closing of a long, painful chapter. The syndicate legacy finally turned toward justice instead of away from it. Voss's response came within the hour. A fleet of steam carriages descending on the union halls with threats of mass arrests. But there were simply too many workers now, standing shoulder to shoulder in coordinated silence, and arresting an entire city's labor force was a threat with no teeth behind it. Voss's own officers, many of them with families dependent on the very factories now sitting dark, hesitated to enforce orders that would only deepen the crisis. By nightfall, the commissioner's office was flooded with demands from city council members, from foreign investors anxious about the sudden industrial collapse, from citizens furious at a blackout with no clear explanation. Voss had built his empire on control and spectacle, and Ezra had just stripped away both in a single day, without firing a single shot. Marta found him again near midnight, delivering the news with grim satisfaction. Voss caved. He's agreed to a public hearing, tomorrow evening, at the Grand Technology Exhibition, in front of every investor and journalist in the city. Says he wants to clear his name publicly, whatever that means. Ezra felt something cold settle in his chest. He's not agreeing to a hearing to clear his name. He's using the exhibition as cover to unveil something. The Ether Core, publicly, in front of every investor who matters, to cement his ownership before anyone can challenge it. Then what do we do? Ezra reached into his coat pocket, closing his hand around the small mechanical shape of the true cipher, the weight of it steady and certain against his palm. Sora's voice echoed in his memory, clear as the moment she'd whispered it against his ear. "Finish what we started. Promise me." "We go to the exhibition," Ezra said. "Not to fight him in the streets. To finish this in front of the entire world. Exactly where he thinks he's about to win." He looked out over the darkened city, the blockade holding steady across every district, a testament to what could be built when an entire city finally decided it was tired of looking away. "Get me inside that exhibition tomorrow night," Ezra said. "Whatever it takes. I made Sora a promise, and I intend to keep it." The grand technology exhibition glittered against the night sky like nothing the blockade had touched. Brass towers strung with electric lights, banners announcing the unveiling of the decade's greatest invention, foreign dignitaries and investors filing through the entrance in furs and top hats, utterly unaware of the darkness choking the rest of the city just beyond the exhibition's private power reserves. Ezra moved through the crowd in a stolen engineer's uniform, Marta's contacts having secured him a maintenance pass through a side entrance normally used for stagehands. His heart hammered against his ribs, the true cipher held tight in his closed fist, every nerve in his body aware that this was the only chance he'd get. On the main stage, beneath a canopy of gaslight and polished brass, Commissioner Alden Voss stood before a covered structure the size of a small carriage, the ether core itself, draped in velvet, waiting for its grand reveal. Beside him, flanked by two guards, stood Sora, hands bound, her face pale but composed, forced to witness the final theft of her life's work, in front of the very people who might have once celebrated her genius. "Tonight," Voss announced to the packed hall, his voice booming through a brass amplification horn, "I present to you the culmination of a decade's work." The ether core, proof that this city's innovation cannot be stopped, even by those who sought to steal its glory for themselves. A ripple of confused murmurs ran through the crowd. Someone near the front called out, asking about the blackout gripping the rest of the city. Voss waved the question away with practiced ease, gesturing toward the velvet-covered core. "A temporary industrial disruption," he said smoothly, "already being resolved. Tonight is about progress, not distraction." Ezra moved through the crowd's edge, working his way toward the stage's side access, watching Sora's eyes scan the hall with quiet, desperate hope, hope that dimmed with every passing second he didn't appear. He caught her gaze for just a moment through a gap in the crowd, and something in her posture straightened instantly, recognition and disbelief crossing her face in equal measure. Voss reached for the velvet covering with a flourish, and the crowd leaned forward in anticipation. "Behold," he began, "the future of this city's power, unveiled at last." Ezra moved. He vaulted onto the stage, from the side steps, before any god could react, closing the distance to the console, beside the covered core, in 3 fast strides. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Voss spun toward him, fury and disbelief warring across his face. "Cade, get him off this stage!" But Ezra had already slammed the true cipher into the console's exposed input port, the one mechanism built into the ether core's original design that only his father's watch, and the confession hidden inside it, could ever properly unlock. The console's brass dials spun wildly for a heartbeat, gears grinding against 8 years of dormant silence. Then the machine screamed to life, not with power, but with light. A massive holographic projection erupting from the ether core's exposed housing, filling the hall with images that made the entire crowd fall utterly silent. Sora's original blueprints, dated and signed, floated above the stage in brilliant blue light, alongside a recorded log, crackling with age, of Voss's own voice from 8 years ago, bragging to unseen accomplices about framing an apprentice for a crime he was about to commit himself. The girl takes the fall, the invention becomes mine, and old Cade rots in a cell, too afraid to say a word about what he saw. Simple, clean. The crowd's shocked silence broke into a rising wave of horrified murmurs. Journalists scrambling for notepads, investors backing away from the stage in real time. Voss stood frozen beneath the projection of his own confession, the mask of respectability he'd worn for 8 years, dissolving in front of hundreds of witnesses. "That recording is fabricated," Voss shouted, but his voice cracked with the panic of a man who knew the truth had finally caught him. "Cade is a criminal, a syndicate boss desperate to discredit. The blueprints bear my signature," Sora said, her voice ringing out clear and steady, despite her bound hands, silencing the hall more effectively than any accusation could. Dated months before the Ether Core's unveiling. "Ask any guild archivist to verify them. Ask the federal auditors to trace the fabricated documents used at my trial back to the commissioner's own office. The truth has been sitting in that watch for 8 years, Commissioner. You just never knew where to look." Federal officers, present at the exhibition as a formality for foreign dignitaries, moved through the stunned crowd with sudden purpose, converging on the stage as Voss's own guards, faced with irrefutable evidence broadcast in front of the entire world, made no move to stop them. Voss was seized within moments, his protests dissolving into desperate, useless denials as he was led from the stage in chains. The same chains he'd once used to march Sora out of the city 8 years before. Ezra crossed the stage and cut the bindings from Sora's wrists with hands that finally stopped shaking. She looked up at him, disbelief and overwhelming relief breaking across her face all at once. "You kept your promise," she whispered. "I told you I would," Ezra said, pulling her into his arms as the hall erupted into stunned applause. Journalists shouting questions. The truth of 8 stolen years finally, publicly, undeniably restored. In the weeks that followed, Ezra's father walked free from prison, pardoned and honored for the confession he'd protected at such enormous personal cost. Sora's name was cleared entirely, her guild credentials restored, her original inventions finally recognized as her own. Ezra stepped down from the syndicate, handing its legitimate operations to Marta, while he and Sora rebuilt something neither of them had dared imagine possible 8 years before. A small engineering workshop of their own, gears turning quietly in the morning light, no longer hiding from anyone. Some nights, Sora would find him at the workbench, tracing the worn brass casing of his father's watch, and she'd sit beside him without a word, exactly as she once had. 2 apprentices, finally free to build the life that had always been waiting for them.